In our last two sessions, we've looked at the idea that the rapture happens before the tribulation, where the church is removed and the believers are removed, and it's the remnant who then go through the tribulation, the pre-tribulation rapture view. We've also looked at the idea that halfway through the rapture, at the 3.5 year break point that Daniel talked about, there's a significant change, and it's at that point where we see the believers being raptured. The third view is called Post-Tribulation, and as you might suspect, it means that it happens after the tribulation. And people who hold to this view, they interpret some of the passages of the Bible, the same verses that we've looked at for the other two interpretations of the tribulation. They take the verses but apply them slightly differently and look at them in a slightly different way. In particular, they pick up on 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 52, where Paul is speaking about our resurrection bodies. And he says, "It will happen in a moment, in the blink of an eye, when the last trumpet is blown. For when the trumpet sounds, those who have died will be raised to live forever, and we who are living will also be transformed." So the post-tribulation view holds that at the last trumpet, at the end of the tribulation, that's when the rapture happens. As we can see with most of the other passages that relate to the rapture, it is a question of perspective, and you have to cross-reference across other parts of the Bible to fully understand where this view's got to. And people who hold to a post-tribulation rapture would take passages like Matthew 24, the Olivet discourse that we've been discussing. Jesus, when he gets to verse 31, says, "He will send out his angels with the mighty blast of a trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of the earth and heaven." And this passage which is being referred to, when Jesus says this, the context of it is after the signs, after the apocalypse, after the tribulation. And so people who hold to this view would look at what Jesus said and says, because Jesus puts it at the end, that's where the tribulation happens. Similarly, when Paul's speaking in 1 Thessalonians 4, when he starts talking about the rapture, he says, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a commanding shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. First the believers who have died will rise from their graves. Then together with them, we who are still alive and remain on the earth will be called up with the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." Both of those passages, the passage where Jesus talks about the rapture and Paul talks about the rapture, refer to this trumpet call. And in Revelation, we see the final trumpet call happening in Revelation 11, verse 15. And it's the seventh trumpet that sort of brings the end of God's wrath to be. The way that this would be interpreted is this would be linked to the final battle. It would be linked to what we read in the later parts of Revelation. So people who take this view would take Revelation 11 and cite it later in the tribulation after some of the events we read in the following chapters. Another verse that is used to evidence a post-tribulation rapture is when Jesus is talking in John chapter 6. And he says in verse 39, "This is the will of God, but I shouldn't lose even one of all those he has given me, but that I should raise them up at the last day." So holders of this view would link the last trumpet and the last day as being at the end of the tribulation, rather than seeing them as something that's happening referring to a period of time which things are happening over. Holders of this view would also see that Israel and the church are one, that all Christians make up a spiritual Israel. And we draw on verses like Galatians 4, where Paul is using an allegory of Hagar and Sarah and Ishmael and Isaac, and in there sees the reference to Jerusalem being the mother of all. And quote verses like Colossians 3, verse 12, where Paul says that the Colossians, God's chosen you to be his holy people. So when we get to verses like the elect, people look at these verses and identify that the church and Israel are one. And in following this through, they would then see that passages like Revelation 19, where Jesus is coming with his army, they would look at that passage where Jesus is coming out of heaven with with all this host of people. They would see that that's angels, and they would look at passages like Zechariah 14 and see that Jesus is going to return with his angels, a bit like in Matthew 24, where Jesus is talking about sending his angels out. So they would say that because Jesus is riding out of heaven on a white horse with his angels, that the resurrection and the rapture happen after that. If we follow this view through and take some of the passages in Revelation 16, where it speaks of some of the horrors that are coming to pass, you still see Jesus saying, I will come unexpectedly as a thief, and blessed are those who are waiting for me. So holders of this view would see that the church is still present and haven't yet been taken to be with Jesus. Following that through into Revelation 20, in verses 4 and 5, where we see the resurrection described as the first resurrection, this is where people who hold to this view would say this is the first evidence we have of resurrection. So the rapture and the resurrection are simultaneous events that happen together. And where that happens, it says that believers don't need to fear the second death. They don't need to fear judgment. They would look at also at passages like Revelation 20 and verses 11 to 15, that judgment is then happening at the end, and is given once for man to die and then judgment. So they see all of that happening together at once. And evidence as well, verses like Revelation 21, where after the millennium, after everything that's happened, at the very end, we see an angel saying to John, "See, come, I will show you the bride." And there's this picture of Jerusalem coming down. So because John is having this description of the bride, people who hold to a post-tribulation rapture are using these verses to say it all happens together at the end of time. I guess by now you might be saying, well, which one do I believe? Well, that's a question for you, between you and God. But I would encourage you to keep your eyes fixed on the main thing. And the main thing is that Jesus is coming back for his bride. All three views look and interpret some of the same verses in slightly different ways. And how they interpret and place some of the passages depends on their perspective on a number of different things. And in our next session, we'll compare and contrast the three views. But for today, if you're sitting there going, I feel a little confused, don't worry, you're in good company. But remember this, Jesus is coming back for his bride. He's coming back for his church, and he will take his church to be with him. And that's something we don't have to be afraid of, but something we can look forward to.